Welcome and thanks everyone for joining this morning. I'm Crystal Hartman, a Chief Chaos Officer for the Arkansas Center for Data Sciences, more so known as ACDS, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to building and retaining top data science and IT talent in the state of Arkansas. One of our main objectives is to facilitate apprenticeship programs in the state with companies large and small across all industries. And with one of our apprenticeship programs being full stack engineer, we're excited to host this event today, Day in the Life of a Full Stack Engineer, to really showcase what an average day is really like, aside from what you learn in school or may research on the World Wide Web. So today's event features Hunter Barron, full stack engineer at C's Education. We're very excited to have Hunter here to share his experience in and expertise of full stack engineering. So if you have any questions during this discussion, please feel free to drop them in the chat, but we'll also open up at the end for Q&A. So now what we're really here for, what does a day in the life of a full stack engineer look like? So thank you so much, Hunter, for being here with us today. We'll start by just having you kind of introduce yourself, sharing a little bit about your background, your organization, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So I went to UA Little Rock. I graduated computer science there. Since then, I've worked at several different companies, and I've been fortunate enough to do a lot of different things. So I haven't really been confined to one tech stack or one very niche specific role. I've gotten to move around and use a lot of different tech stacks, use a lot of different technologies. And so that's been a great experience, and I've really enjoyed doing that. But my current role is at C's Education. I'm a full stack engineer there. So I predominantly work on one very large Rails application there. It's a Rails Angular application. So mostly over the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of time in Ruby on Rails and Angular and kind of all the things that entails. So yeah, excited to be here.
Well, we're excited. So the big question of this morning, what does a typical day in the life of a full stack engineer really like?
Yeah, so I would say there are certain things throughout the day that are pretty typical, that you kind of are a part of your day no matter what. So a lot of the things that you're doing or actively working on, you generally manage through some type of project management system like Jira. So maybe you have like a board there that you can see like what you're actively working on, what you just finished, what's coming up next. You do a lot of kind of back and forth communication via something like Slack with your coworkers. Not a lot of meetings, which is really nice. And that seems to be the case for everyone I know in this field, that it's not big on meetings, not big on things like that, which is really great. But honestly, a lot of the day really does, you spend a lot of time, writing code, or you kind of working with code. So a lot of what you do is, whether you're maybe trying to figure out why something's breaking or you're actually writing something new, you actually do spend a lot of time in the code, so to speak. Beyond that, I would say what a day looks like kind of depends on what you're doing on a more broader scale. So in most roles that I've been a part of or I've seen, you do a few different things. So there will be times when you're working on, say, like a new feature, like a large feature, or and maybe even a new project, like a new application. And that kind of is its own, that's kind of its own thing compared to, say, working on like some defects or something, things that are breaking and then you have to fix those, or even addressing like technical debt, just looking out for where you can make your code base or your application like more scalable or better or more maintainable, refactoring things that are kind of messy. But for me, I really enjoy working on kind of new feature implementation. So for that, you actually will spend, let's say, up to several weeks to maybe even several months working on a new feature and really focusing in on that and not really bounce around from one thing to the next. So there's kind of a different flow to that in your day than it is when
Sure.
you're working on, say, like just fixing a small breakage, or maybe looking into some tech debt, or other kind of smaller jump around items. So there's some variability, but there's also some constancy. So
So when you're kind of developing, I'm going to jump a little bit off, but when you are developing in this, do you, as you're adding features, do you have like your go-to for, I guess, I don't want to say inspiration, but that helps you determine what is, what is something that is valuable or invaluable, or, how do you typically do something like that, or gauge your
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it kind of depends, right? Like, so the organization, or the company I'm at right now, we have a whole product team, and that's really what they do, is they figure out
okay.
what can be added to, like the project or to the application that's going to benefit customers. And generally what they do, and I think what's done in most cases like that, is, they look for what are users asking for, what are they what kind of feedback are they getting, are certain things working that could maybe be done better, stuff like that. And then they look at that, look at how they can actually turn that into a feature. And then that goes through kind of a design process, and then it gets to us, and it's pretty well spec'd out at that point. There still
Okay.
can be some back and forth in terms of like, well, this isn't totally feasible, or maybe we have to do this a little different. But it kind of goes through that. But I've been part of other companies where I had a little bit more of a role in that kind of initial, what should we add to this application. And it kind of follows the same process. That I think you kind of listen to your users, and maybe it's different for different stages of a company. Maybe when you're first starting out, you don't really have users, right? So if you're a startup, you don't exactly know what features are going to be really valuable. But I think you iterate pretty quickly, and a lot of it should be probably driven by what people are asking for. So
Okay, great. So what are some of the attributes or skills that someone in your position should have?
yeah, so there's a couple things that kind of come to mind right away. Is I think it probably helps to be like tend towards being analytically minded. I don't think, not to say that like you have to be full on that side of your brain, but I think it does help to be more or less analytical, just because there's a lot of problem solving, and there's a lot of things, there's a lot of times where you'll have weird problems, and it kind of takes really thinking about it in a logical way to figure out what's actually going on. Another big thing that I don't see talked about a lot, but that I do see in reality, is that by the nature of this type of job, you don't have someone, at the vast majority of companies, vast majority of roles, you don't have someone who is going to be sitting over your shoulder every hour making sure that you're doing what you need to do. I would say in general, software engineers have a much longer leash, and they're allowed a lot more autonomy than maybe other types of roles, or other types of jobs, period. So I think it's really important to be able to manage yourself and be able to manage your time and kind of keep yourself accountable. I really enjoy the autonomy, but of course, it can definitely get away from you. I've seen that happen with people too, where they need a little more structure. And so I think just figuring out kind of how to make that work for yourself is, a big part of it. But beyond that, I think having an open, being open-minded, being open to, make sure that you are continuing to learn new things as they come up, and really not having an ego about things. So even if you're a senior engineer, or if you've been at this a long time, maybe there's someone a lot newer in the room. If they have a good idea, be open to it. So I've
Okay.
seen that kind of go the other way too. And I think that a lot of people hit walls because of that, because they kind of let their ego get in the way, or they stop learning, or stop trying to learn new things. They just stick to the thing they know.
Great. So initially I was going to say, like, has that changed in recent years? But I imagine that, that not having somebody looking over your shoulder in the office was a lot different than than at home, working from home. So I know that that's shifted, but what's changed over the recent years in, what skills and attributes that you do need in order to be successful?
Yeah, just like you said. I mean, I think even if you worked in an office before all of this, as an engineer, it's still, like I said, just by the nature of the work, you weren't. It's for most organizations, someone's not, uh, very frequently checking in on you and telling you what you need to do. So probably even more so now, like I said, because now everyone's at home. So even if you were in an office now, it's even more so. So I think that is something, that even if you were decent at it before, you probably had to really adjust and really manage yourself and your time well. But beyond that, I mean, I don't know how much has changed in our roles. I wouldn't say that there's a different new hot tech stack or new hot framework that comes out every 3 months. So, I mean, that's just normal, and that's of course kept pace. But most of the times, it's kind of shot in the dark as to which one of those are actually going to end up sticking and really proliferating throughout the community. So nothing like that really major has changed. I've just seen the emphasis on remote work change, and that's obviously beyond just this role of being a software engineer. Of course, this role in particular really lends itself to remote work, but
Sure.
I think I see a lot of companies that are really kind of reconsidering the value of an office, especially for certain types of work, software engineer in particular, where, if your employees are happier, they're generally more productive, and you maybe don't have to pay money to lease office space or whatever you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a win-win all around. So I see a lot of companies that are really kind of long-term reconsidering how they want to have certain parts of their teams operate.
Sure. Um, what are some ways that full stack engineers can add value or impact large businesses?
Yeah, so I mean, um, well, the obvious is yeah, right. So
I was like, I know there's obvious ones,
there's an
but
obvious, right? Like if you are a software engineer, if you're a full stack engineer and you work for a company, they probably sell software, or they probably sell the service of building software. So there's obviously that one. But I think that the really good teams, I'm on a really good team now, and for what I've noticed is that the really good teams, like I said, there's the obvious. If you're a software engineer, you're building software that someone's selling, but there's a lot more to a company than, of course, just the software engineers. And just like if you're, a more sales oriented company, there's, more to that company than just sales. I think the really good teams I've been on and the one I'm currently on have done a really good job of being able to talk to different parts of the company, different layers of the company, and understand and kind of empathize with their concerns. Like, what are the things they need? Why are their priorities this way? We might not be able to see just through the code, like what needs to be done, but they're getting feedback from customers. They're looking at financials. So I think having a more of a collaborative approach with other teams and trying to understand like why their priorities are, the way they are and kind of where they're coming from really helps. And I think the teams I've been on that were part of that tend to do a lot better work. The company overall tends to produce, at a much higher level when the teams can kind of easily collaborate with each other and kind of get where each other's coming from. So I think that's kind of a non-obvious answer.
Is it difficult for businesses to attract strong full stack engineer talent? And is there a skill shortage to that?
I think it's actually, at least in my mind, I think it's actually kind of it's a weird problem. So at some levels, yes, I would say there is a shortage. Or there's, if you're a full stack engineer, you're on the right side of supply and demand. But it kind of happens in phases in your career. So I think when you're starting out, you are maybe you're just out of college or just out of like a code camp, or you've kind of developed your skills independently and you're trying to land that first job. You're kind of, not totally, but generally more relegated to what's around you, right? Or where you're willing to move. Maybe you can get a job somewhere if you're willing to move there. But at least from what I've seen, a lot of companies are a little more hesitant to hire like a remote engineer if they're a junior engineer, if it's their first job. So you're a little more confined to kind of where you are in that regard. But then if you have a certain level of experience, that opens up and you can really work for whoever, and whether they're down the street or they're, in a different country, all of those opportunities are open. So when you're in that space, then I would say definitely there's a wide variety of jobs that you have. So for companies to attract the right talent, I think it depends, right? Pay is the most obvious. Compensation, that's the most obvious, and that's something that you see and is pushed really hard. But I think what I'm seeing a lot now too, with people I know and people I've worked with, I think there's the lifestyle, right? There's the work-life balance that's really important, and there's also the growth potential. Like, what are you actually going to be doing at this company? There are some really high-paying jobs where you really probably aren't learning anything, right? Like you're doing a very routine role, and it's nothing that's current or that's kind of like going to help you advance your skills for future opportunities. So that's something that I've seen really come into focus. Because pay only takes you so far. You get to a certain point, you want to develop your skills, you want to develop your career as a whole. And so I think a lot of people I know, when they are evaluating if they want to work somewhere, they're looking at those things. So as a company, I think orienting yourself to make sure that you're paying attention to those things and creating a career path for people coming in, and kind of fostering those things in the way that you bring up your engineers. So you take someone from a junior, have levels for them to advance. And it's not just about pay, it's about actually advancing in their skills and their career.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, kind of looking at, I'm just gonna look at the question that's in chat from Damien. So what core materials did you study when becoming a full stack developer? And I think this goes with, if you're stagnant at the position, what would you want to be exploring and learning to help advance you in your career path?
Yeah. So I've worked in several different tech stacks at this point. But one thing you kind of learn is that if you can really learn one of those, learning a different one a lot of them do the same things. I mean, if it's an MVC framework, and it's a kind of a stack built around that, then it might be .NET, it might be Ruby on Rails or Django, but it's all going to be, they're all going to be solving very similar problems. So but I think it helps to really just pick one of those and really learn it. And maybe if you were trying to maybe, like I said, step into this kind of thing, learn one of those, do some projects with it, like really explore it and think about, just beyond like the, language specific things that you're doing or framework specific things that you're doing. What are the problems you're actually solving with this? Like, Rails, for instance, has a lot of things that make it easy to work with databases, right? So, but you might not realize that while you're actually writing Rails code or writing Ruby code in Rails. And so thinking about kind of the bigger picture really helps. And then to me at least, it's made it a lot easier to transition. If you need to go work in a different tech stack for a week or whatever, you kind of know how things are going to work, even if it's relatively new to you. The problems that they're trying to solve with this, with this framework. So,
okay.
I don't know if I answered the question or not, but.
But yeah. So, when you're thinking about getting into this career path, so my favorite question really to ask is like, what advice do you wish somebody would have gave you? So for future workforce of full stack engineering, what advice do you give someone that's just starting out that you wish someone would have gave you?
Yeah, there's probably a lot of advice someone should have given me when I started out. That would have been helpful. But I I mean, there, certain things that I think, you might hear a bit. One thing is just like be patient. So I think, it takes a long time. I play the drums, so I equate things to learning, a musical instrument, but it's not just a musical instrument, it could be any skill, right? But it takes time. So when you maybe if you're really truly just starting out, and you've never written a line of code in your life, but you're interested, something you need to understand is that it probably won't be very enjoyable until maybe you're 2 or 3 months in and you have that first aha moment, right? So just like, if you're playing an instrument, the first time you play is honestly not very fun, right? But after a couple months, you've gotten to the point where, if it's on the drums, you can play like a basic beat and do a fill that kind of sounds good. And then it's fun, right? And they're like, oh, this is what drumming is. But it's the same thing with this. It's not something that you'll probably enjoy immediately. But if you want to see if it's for you and if it's for something that you actually might really like, as a career, I think you got to give it at least a couple months of getting past that initial, just like banging your head against the keyboard to get things set up, and allow yourself to have that first aha moment. The classic advice is find mentors, find people that maybe a coworker. It doesn't have to be a super formalized mentor relationship, but maybe a coworker, or someone that that's maybe a little further ahead than you, that you can learn from. I mean, that's the best way really to learn, is to learn from people who have already done the things you want to do. And then the last, and this is something I don't see talked about a whole lot, especially for people who are starting out. So if you're starting out, your options in terms of jobs are going to be more limited than as you progress further in your career. So it makes sense when you're starting out, you kind of take what you can get. But really, after that first job, I think it's really important to think about what you actually want to do, maybe let's say over the next 2 to 5 years, right? And find a job, like when you're ready to leave that, find a job that lines up with that. So don't just look at pay, don't just look at, maybe title or something like that, but what are you actually going to be doing? So if your goal is you want to learn the most that you can, you need to find a role that you believe kind of will fit that, right? Because I've seen a lot of people just take the highest offer they have, and they're pretty miserable after a year. They're not learning, they're not growing, they're not learning new things, and they feel like they're kind of getting left behind. But they're getting paid well, so maybe that's what they wanted. But I do think it's important to be really intentional about the types of roles that you have. Like what's going to make you happy? Is it going to make you happy to make a lot of money? Well, maybe then do that. But is it going to make you happier to be on a great team where you learn a lot and you actually like what you do, and you're learning skills that you're actually interested in, doing things that you find interesting? So I don't see that talked about a lot, and I don't see that mentioned a lot, but I think that's something that even when you're young in your career, you can really start to think about and kind of angle yourself in the right direction.
Sure. Um, a good question that, and I know we kind of briefly talked about it, the first question of, what is the typical day like? But do you have a routine that you currently kind of go through? And, if yes, could you share more or less of what that's like?
Just like kind of a daily kind of routine
Yeah.
to, yeah. I mean, so kind of, I mean, I kind of I know a lot of engineers that keep kind of a crazy erratic schedule. I keep a pretty like normal schedule. Like I'm, 8 to 5 is like when I'm working generally. And so routine wise, I will say, and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about. Like, it depends what you're kind of working on at the moment. If I'm going to work on, if I come in and see that, like, I know I'm not working on like a new huge feature implementation that's going to take 3 months to actually build out. So if I'm in that in between time and I have like, 3 different items that I'm going to work on that are all totally different for that day, then that's a little different. And I think, at least for me, it kind of takes a little more time to warm up. This is idea of context switching, that you're jumping between contexts, it actually takes your brain a little bit to kind of catch up and get into the new context, especially if you're working on something that's pretty complicated. So if that's the case, then it usually takes me a little bit more time to kind of build up steam. But if I'm in the middle of like working on a new feature, and I'm like 3 weeks into that and it's all just right there in my brain, I don't really, for me, I like to get up and just, immediately start working, relatively make coffee, start working, but pretty quickly. And I think that I've noticed that if I do that and I'm able to at least be, let's say, productive for the first 30 minutes of the day, it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the day. So
Sure.
I found that to be really helpful, because I mean, this kind of work is a little different than other types of jobs or other types of work, in that there is, I would say, at least a part of it that's kind of, maybe a little more creative, in the sense that, you're writing stuff, you're building stuff, you're making stuff, and there's a flow to that too, right? So you can definitely like stare at your keyboard for quite a while without doing anything. There are days like that too, for sure. But I think that if you are trying to be productive, if you can just get in and try to just hammer out a few things like pretty quickly at the top of the morning, then you're going to probably have a relatively good day.
Sure. Not putting out a fire when you first, mid coffee. That
Yeah.
always helps. So,
Yeah.
um,
Exactly.
so, what are some, I know that you said you use kind of that project management tool, but are there any other tools that you use to help you kind of stay on track, or determine, the importance of, I imagine some of it is there's dependencies. But is there any other tool or tools that you are kind of your go-tos?
Yeah, I mean, so like I'll use a couple different like text editors, Sublime, Atom, in terms of when I'm actually writing code. Vim if I have to, and most organizations I've worked for use Git, so obviously there's a lot of those kind of, and that's another thing that I don't think, I mean, especially if you're coming from a school, and it's been a while since I was in school, so I don't know if things have changed, but that was not something that was like really well taught when I was in school. Was like, there's understanding like how to write code and some of those fundamentals, but there's actually just a whole different side to this, in terms of like what are the professional tools you use that really aren't necessarily like writing code with them, right? Like Git is just a way to kind of keep up with your changes and push your changes and manage the different changes coming in from different people on a project. But stuff like that, I would definitely advise anyone, especially if you're coming at this on your own. I think they do a pretty good job of this in like code camps, because they have them build out these real projects, and I think they generally make them use like the kind of tools that you would expect to use on the job. I don't know what the state of that is in college, but if you're not using something like Git, or you're not using some type of like repository system, I would strongly recommend just looking at that, so that when you're trying to land that first job, you're not intimidated by that. But just tools like that. So Git, whatever text editor is normal, like if you're in a .NET framework, obviously getting familiar with the IDE and all of that. So figuring out the job you want, the tools you want, that's all really important. But other than that, I'm pretty old school. I mean, I don't use a lot of like super fancy things. I'll just like open up a notepad and like scratch out ideas that way. Yeah. If I'm trying to, think about something new, or just trying to get my thoughts out on paper, let's kind of go that route.
I'm like the sticky notes and pen and paper have become so underrated.
Seriously, yeah.
It's weird to be like, oh, we're old school, because that's what we do to like keep track. But I have mentioned before, I'm like, there's nothing more satisfying than like the sound of a crumpled up sticky note.
Yeah.
I'm like, and you just can't get that through some of the software.
No, definitely.
So I think now we'll open up for Q&A. if anyone has any questions, and I think you have the ability to unmute yourselves.
Yes, I actually just redid the security, so everybody should be able to unmute. And we've had some great questions so far, so I'm excited to see.
Yeah. Yes, too.
Awesome.
There can't be, and no questions. So I mean, I have questions for days. So for somebody that is getting or considering this career path, is there something, if you're just starting out in school, I know there's kind of a structure to that, to degrees, but is there something that you recommend that should kind of take precedence over, another, or that you should take first, or, something that would help you get a head start into understanding all the different, concepts and levels of full stack engineering?
Yeah. So I think if you're starting out in school, or maybe you're taking a code camp, I mean, first, like, you obviously want to spend a little time making sure that this is something, because like something like college or even a coding academy, it's a pretty big financial commitment and time commitment. So of course you want to make sure that's something you want to do. And I would harken back to just that whole idea of like pushing yourself for a few months and just giving yourself enough time to have that first aha moment and see if you really like it. I think that would be really helpful. But then once you're to that point, if you do want to kind of get a head start, I would say that I don't know if there's not really like a shortcut, so to speak, right? But
Sure.
I think there's a lot of great online sources, but it helps just to understand like, so like the term like a full stack engineer, honestly, every term in this line of work kind of means something different. It depends on what company you're at. It can mean something totally different. I've met, all different types of titles that would match completely separate other types of titles, for different companies. But when I think of like full stack engineer, I think that it is, it's a role that involves kind of being at least comfortable with every layer of the tech stack that you use, like to work on your application. So like there's a traditional idea of like a front end, back end engineer. So like a front end engineer would be like someone who works more on the UI side, maybe works with like a framework, like a JavaScript framework like Angular or React or something like that. And then the back end person would be the kind of person who's working on more of like the guts of the application. They're working on the services and the actual business logic and the things that those things are kind of pinging back and forth from. But what I would say, I would scope it out into a broader definition, which is I think in general you should be comfortable with every layer of like your tech stack. So it's not just the application itself. You at least have some familiarity and comfort with your integration and deployment. So however, whatever systems you have in place to manage that, you should at least understand them. You might not be actively working on those at all times, but you should certainly understand them and be able to fix them if need be. And then that could go all the way down to the servers that your application run on. So whether you're using a cloud service like AWS, like pretty much everyone is, understanding how to provision those servers, how does that process work for your organization? Do you have some type of automated process to do that? So server goes down, how do you bring it back up? How do you make sure all the dependencies are installed so that it actually run your application? And then of course to the data layer, understanding the database like in and of itself, and not just as like this thing that you say save in your code to, right? But something that actually kind of exists in and of itself. And then that goes, up to the actual backend layer of the application code where you are tying into the database and, maybe you're building out your APIs, your services, your business logic kind of lives there. And then all the way up to the front end, which, as I said, you might have like a front end stack, and maybe that's React, maybe that's Angular, maybe that's some type of like JavaScript framework that allows you to do really powerful things up front. Maybe it's just plain, maybe it's just jQuery and HTML and some assets and that's it. But so that's a lot of stuff, right? There's a lot of stuff. So a part of this, I think it helps to approach this at a high level and not think I need to be an expert in absolutely every single one of those things as soon as possible, right? Honestly, that just takes a long time of just dealing with these things and, having experience with them and experience them in different situations. And so, but I think you can really accelerate your learning by understanding how those two different pieces fit together, right? So when a lot of people start out and they're just learning to write code, everything else is kind of like, it's very out in the ether. All the stuff that's actually happening to make that code work and to make that stuff go out and be pushed to servers, and how the database works. All that stuff is kind of, like I said, just out in the ether. So I think just spending some time learning on a high level how these pieces fit together. For me, that was a really helpful, especially when I was first starting out, just to give me context, right? I wasn't an expert in any of those things, or I wasn't, totally, I wasn't totally skilled in every single one of those things starting out, but I was able to get just a high level understanding, and it made me a lot more, it felt like it accelerated my learning in general, but it also made me a lot more comfortable in what I was doing. So definitely recommend that. And you can start doing that as soon as you kind of get past those, first 3 to 6 months. You can really start to, kind of put the pieces together at a high level.
Okay. Are there, or what are some good volunteer resources where someone new to this career could partner with other developers to increase the knowledge and build a resume with their projects?
So I don't know any, off the top of my head, I don't know any. I think there are several different ways you could go about that. You could do something like go on like Freelancer or Upwork.com, and if you develop your skills up into even, let's say like a junior level or whatever, or maybe even like, even below that, but you know how to do some things, you can go on something like that and take on actual professional projects and do them. But honestly, if if you do want to maybe build your portfolio, so to speak, like you're trying to land that first job and you want to build your portfolio, the thing, to do honestly would just be to pick stuff that you want to do, that you think is cool, and just like, work on that. And it doesn't have to end up being this incredible, multi-million-dollar app or anything like that. But if you can make some progress on that, you're going to learn a lot. And if you can get, it to do something that you think is cool, chances are the person you're interviewing with will probably think the same thing. So that shows a lot of initiative. There is one thing, and I don't know, I mean, I guess this is tangentially related to that question, but just with the whole, a lot of this is about how do you land your first job, or what do you do when you're just starting out. There's an unfortunate thing that is a part of this business and a part of this line of work, which is the interview process. So a lot of times an interview process, and I've been in a lot on both sides of the process, and for a lot of companies, not all, but a lot of companies, a big part of it is this idea of the kind of the coding portion of your interview, right? And so what that's turned into in a lot of cases is you will be asked to solve like pretty contrived and pretty like nonsensical coding challenges that don't really relate at all to what you'll be doing day to day. Like they'll ask you some obscure dynamic programming problem, watch you solve it. The idea is that they'll, kind of want to see how you work through a problem. But honestly, it's, I don't think it's the best way to evaluate how good someone's going to be, but it's a part of it. And I think if you are early in the process of trying to land that first job, or you're out there and you're kind of thinking about those types of things, get on something like hackerrank.com, get on something like LeetCode, and just practice those stupid problems over and over, and just get really comfortable with them, because it probably will come up in at least one of your interviews. And it's something that, unless you practice it, you're probably not going to do very well at, and that can sink an otherwise promising opportunity. So that's a big one. I'm really not a fan of that, but it's just part of it. So
What was your first project that you worked on, or that you either, individually, or, as part of a team?
Yeah, so in school, I worked on a computer vision problem. That was, I don't know, like 10-ish years ago now, I guess. I don't know how long I've been out of school. I don't even know what age I am, but uh, I I worked on a computer vision problem. That was probably like one of the first big things I did. The basic idea there was to take a reel of images and used this was before the explosion of like really commonplace accessible AI tools that you could use to do this kind of stuff. So this was when they were using some of the more like heuristic approaches that were part of like computer vision up until everything started being pushed into neural nets. But um, it was the basic idea was to take a bank of images and try to identify like human emotions via facial expressions. So that was cool. That was like one of the first kind of big project I worked on. That was really fun. The first kind of professional project I worked on was like an e-commerce site. It was built in .NET, and it was kind of a life sciences, kind of like an e-commerce site for scientific instruments, essentially, that was kind of catering to that specific market. But that was cool too, because that was like the first web framework that I really worked on. And as I mentioned earlier, I think like once you get a good feel for how one of those frameworks work, how one of those actually operate, and what are the ins and outs and what are the problems they're trying to solve, it makes it a lot easier to then go like, oh, I'm going to go learn Django, or I'm going to go learn, Ruby on Rails after that. So that was cool. But yeah, probably those two I'd consider, 1 and 2 on those.
Okay. Any other questions? I feel like we covered like such a plethora of knowledge in this. We're all gonna have to go back and watch the recording, and we'll know we missed something. Okay, so great question from Daniel. What do you think is the best way to impress an employer? So this is great if you've been on both sides of an interview and you are interviewing folks. What has someone done that has really stuck out to you?
Interesting. That's a good question. So there are certain things. Maybe it depends on the role you're hiring for, right? You're hiring for a junior engineer, senior engineer. Are you hiring for an intern? Whatever, right? But
Oh, junior.
okay, junior engineer. Okay, good. Let's give it as much specificity as possible. Honestly, so one thing is that I would say, if you, like I said, you want to practice the things that are definitely going to come up in an interview. There's a good chance there might be some type of coding challenge. So practice stuff like that. They will probably, especially if you're a junior engineer and you might not have a ton of professional experience, you might not have, or they might want to see some of the things you've worked on, whether that's school or personal projects. I think personal projects can go a long way. If you have some cool personal projects that are pretty well built out, and not to say they don't have to be like production ready, shippable, major code, right? But like just things that are like well thought out and interesting, and that you've clearly spent some time on, and that you've clearly like kind of that you really understand too. That's been, we had a guy that we at a company I worked at, we hired from a coding academy, and he had this essentially kind of a personal project, but it wasn't just what the project was doing. It was like his passion for the project kind of showed through, and he really understood the ins and outs of how like that thing worked. It doesn't matter if it was big, doesn't matter if it was small, but he really understood how it worked, and like, why he made certain decisions to do things certain ways. And that, I think that was really impressive. But another thing that's underrated is just like demonstrating that you have a good attitude, and demonstrating that you are willing to learn, and that you're easy to get along with. honestly, at an entry level position, whether it's intern or junior engineer, that can really go a long way. And that means a lot, because most people, especially if they've gotten some type of education or they've spent some time learning this stuff, they can advance their skills, right? But a big part of that is just having a good attitude and just being able to demonstrate that you have a good attitude, getting along with people, and showing that you're willing to humble yourself, ask questions, that you're willing to kind of take guidance. That can really go a long way. So yeah, I would say that, and a project that you really care about and then you could really talk about would definitely help you stand out.
Do you know of any, I think kind of just building off of Jenny's question, but do you know of any organizations or different groups that someone that is just starting off could essentially find a mentor, or and maybe it's not someone that's within the company, maybe it's a mentor that's in a more advanced role, but not necessarily a direct a direct manager or direct overseer.
Yeah. I mean, off the top of my head, no, I don't. Well, so I mean, there are ways to do it, right? I'm sure there are probably, honestly, there are probably some online platforms for this, but I don't know them off the top of my head. I'm sure someone's built that, surely, but I don't know it off the top of my head. But there are probably ways to do it. So one thing you can do is, I know in Arkansas or in Little Rock, and I'm sure in Northwest Arkansas too, there are meetup groups, right? And you guys, what y'all do, y'all throw, before the pandemic, y'all were throwing a lot of events, several of which I went to, and, met a lot of really cool people. And I think if you're looking to meet someone and maybe get some, kind of develop that kind of relationship, that's a good way to do it. So if you don't, maybe if you're not working in your field right now and you're trying to break in, and you would like to get a mentor in the meantime, that would probably be the best way to do it, is just figure out where people are gathering. I mean, we have a tech fest in Little Rock too, that's actually, that was growing, like crazy. Of course, pandemic, but I think that hopefully we'll be coming out of this soon and things will be kind of back to normal. And so those are the types of things, just try to get, go out and go to these types of meetups and these types of events and meet with people. But really, it's beyond that. Having the goal of like developing those relationships is really important. So you want to, not only just show up, but show up with the intention of actually meeting someone and developing a relationship with them, talking with them, and, learning about what they do, and they can kind of, have the back and forth. I think that's really important. So there's a lot of people, I've seen sometimes people just show up and just, kind of shake your hand and say hello. And, you don't get too far that way. Right. So showing up with the intention of like, I'm going to, be personable, try to meet people, try to develop relationships, look at it that way, right? Look at it as like you're developing relationships. You're not just looking for this kind of like transactional thing, but you're trying to, meet and mingle with people who like the stuff that you like. So.
All right. I realized to be, respectful of time, we're at 11:50. And so I didn't know if anyone has any last question, but, we certainly want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to just, share your wisdom with us, kind of, oh gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Motivate and really inspire. That's the word. Inspire individuals that are just getting out into this. So, it's always nice to hear from someone that is doing it and kind of learning where they started and, what advice they wish they had and where to go, if you are starting out. So we really appreciate you taking the time today to just meet with us and talk about it and share your knowledge. So.
Absolutely. Anytime. I really enjoyed it. And I love what you guys are doing. So yeah, let's keep it going.
All right. Hopefully we'll see everyone at a live Tech After 5 sooner than later. But yeah, thanks everyone for attending with us today. We have a few upcoming events next week. So I just highly recommend going to our website, acds.co/calendar. And it lists a couple of really great events in addition to this one that we have in the next week. So So yeah,
Hey, Crystal,
yes.
if they have